Fran Tarkenton, the quarterback, said to me once, Soledad, if you have 3 quarterbacks, you have no quarterbacks. And I remember thinking, like, I know nothing about sports metaphors. That means absolutely nothing to me, Fran. Thank you. But what he was trying to say was this idea of, like, if you don't commit to the story you're going to tell, then you have nothing. You have a big blob of trying to pop lots of different things in, and you end up with nothing at all.
Welcome to the Nieman Storyboard podcast, where we dig into the craft of journalism and storytelling. I'm Mark Armstrong, editor of Nieman Storyboard. This show is brought to you by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. You can get updates by signing up for our newsletter. Just go to niemanstoryboard.org to sign up. Today, I am thrilled to welcome back Storyboard contributor Christina M. Tapper. Hi, Christina.
Hey, Mark. What's going on?
So we have a wonderful guest today, Soledad O'Brien.
Yes.
Tell me about your conversation.
Oh, it was great. Well, first off, many of the listeners know who Soledad is, but in case you don't, Soledad O'Brien is an award-winning journalist, documentarian, and author whose career is so prolific. It's hard to run down all of her credits and her honors, but here's a bit of it. Soledad does human-focused journalism while tackling issues like race, poverty, healthcare, and social justice. In 2013, she founded Soledad O'Brien Productions, a multi-platform media production company dedicated to telling empowering and authentic stories on a range of social issues. She anchored shows and hosted specials on CNN, MSNBC, NBC, and BET. Most recently, she was the host of the TV political magazine program Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien and was a correspondent for HBO Real Sports. She also co-hosted and produced the true crime podcast Who Killed JFK. Her work has been recognized with multiple Emmys and Peabodys, and as I mentioned in our conversation, Soledad wears many hats. She's a true veteran in journalism, so it was great to be in conversation with her today.
Yeah, I loved hearing about her journey from CNN to documentaries and podcasts, and what was driving that in terms of sort of looking for forms that kind of work to build more understanding and giving more space to the subjects.
Yes.
And some of the documentaries that the most recent documentaries she worked on. Can you tell me about some of those documentaries?
Sure. So most recently, she's worked on documentaries such as The Devil is Busy, which is on HBO Max, as well as she was an EP on the Netflix documentary, The Perfect Neighbor. In those documentaries, she's kind of behind the scenes, but also she's done short docs like The War on La Radio and The End of Affirmative Action, where she's actually the host, the narrative voice in those docs. Soledad has the type of range where she is a journalist and reporter, and she's also able to give creative direction and notes behind the scenes as an EP. And so, again, that's just a sampling of the work that she's done in the documentary space. But also in this conversation, we talk about how her Hurricane Katrina coverage really helped shape her trajectory, the work that she's doing now, but also the reporter she has become. And that's her Hurricane Katrina coverage at CNN 20 years ago.
Yeah, and that led into a really great story that you had her share about, just the whole idea of bearing witness as a journalist, which I feel like an ongoing thread in your conversations at Storyboard and my conversations on this podcast with various journalists about this time in which some journalists can be frustrated about whether accountability is happening or whether a story is getting out there in the way that they hoped, but just the fact of being there and recording history is a lot on its own, right?
So important. And I'm happy that Soledad was able to share that story when she was younger. One of her first examples of the significance of being a witness came from her mother. And so we get into that in this episode too. And that in and of itself really shapes the way that she does the work, but also how she lives her life.
Absolutely. So it's a great conversation. So let's get to it. Without further ado, here is Christina's conversation with Soledad O'Brien.
Soledad O'Brien, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So you have such a prolific career anchoring, reporting, producing work about real issues and impacting real people. You've been in the documentary space for some time and now have a production company that's been around for more than a decade.
Yeah.
What draws you to the documentary space?
Even when I was working as a TV anchor, I was doing a lot of doc projects for CNN. And what I've always liked about the doc space, and I probably did 40 or 50 hours of documentaries when I was at CNN over all those years. But docs allow people to talk. And one thing I find frustrating about news stories, just because of the time limitations, right? If you have a 90-second piece or a minute 15, which is kind of a standard nightly news type piece, a 10-second soundbite, 15-second soundbite is sort of typical. And one of the things I've really loved about documentaries, and especially the projects that we're in the middle of now, is that you just really unwind people's stories. They get to tell their story. So when we did a show called Matter of Fact, which we did for about 10 years, we just wrapped it this past summer. Our pieces ran about 4.5 minutes, and which was a luxury. Like 4.5 minutes on a newscast is insane. But to really have a doc short at 30 minutes or a full-length doc at 90 minutes is I just like hearing from the people who are the center of the documentary. And I think it adds a lot of value. I think it adds a lot of context, and I think it's very interesting.
Many of our listeners are journalists and storytellers who are trying out new mediums. What advice would you give them if they're interested in producing documentaries? A little laugh there.
First of all, I think it's really cool to try out new mediums all the time. And I've always been very good at just hopping into things. Some of that is the impact of having kids in their 20s, because they're always like, Mom, learn this dance for TikTok. But I would say just kind of do it. It's very easy if you're a professional journalist or a semi-professional journalist to be like, no, I need the light to be right. And actually, I need to know the story and who's done the survey of the, and it doesn't. Just get out there and do it. It's the same advice, frankly, I give students when I'll go and speak at a school. That start a podcast, start interviews, just do it and have a place. I mean, now with technology, it's not very expensive to enter, and you can kind of see your work and critique your work. And even if you have 6 people who are on your little list of people who get a chance to, your distribution list, I think it's a really good way to practice and see what you like. And then as you go, you add on and say, you know what, actually, I should shoot it here. And this was too loud. And this is not how I would do it. And this camera's actually not very good. And this is the way I would do that. And boy, I learned a lot. So I think it's a learning process. And I think the key is to be very forgiving and just jump in. You can do a 4-minute documentary. And then you can do a 10-minute documentary. You can do it on anything in your neighborhood, whatever interests you. And by that, you practice your storytelling muscle. You work that muscle and you just learn a lot. I remember the first podcast I did. I told the people, I've never done a podcast, and I'm doing this podcast because I'd like to learn how to do a podcast. And I said, so I need you guys to give me feedback. If you like my read, if you don't like my read. And it was just really helpful. And it was a lot of fun to sort of just jump into something that you weren't good at and that you didn't know how to do, and you had to figure it out.
Right. Getting your reps in is definitely important. What podcast was that you're referring to?
That's a great question. I think it was Murder on the Towpath, which we did during the pandemic. We started it during the pandemic. You can actually catch it on iHeart right now because, of course, in the pandemic production, I was recording the early parts of it in my closet because I didn't know studio or anything, right. No one was allowed to be in the same room with anybody else. And they were great. The folks who were the production team we work with were just excellent and so good at giving feedback and trying to make it better. When we would do the podcast, Who Killed JFK, which I did along with Rob Reiner, and by then I was producing that podcast as well as, being one of the hosts of that podcast with Rob. I had learned so much. And then we were doing a 14-part podcast with 9 million, new listeners. So, I couldn't have done that without doing the first one and without the patience of all the people around me who say, yeah, let's do that again. Let's do that again. Let's take that again.
Patience is key.
Yes.
So I'd love to talk a bit about some of your recent documentaries. One of the documentaries you produced is The Devil is Busy, about a day at an Atlanta abortion clinic and the fight for reproductive rights. It's under 40 minutes, and you and your team tell the story mostly through Tracy, the head of security at the clinic, who's very protective and has a story of her own. Patients are present in the film, as are clinicians. However, Tracy is the thread from start to finish. How did you determine this was going to be the clinic to feature and that this story would be told through Tracy?
I think it was old-fashioned reporting. Crystal and Hampton, who's our director, along with Geeta Gandabir, they just went to clinic after clinic. We knew very early on, I think a lot of people knew, that Roe v. Wade was dead, right? It was going to the Supreme Court, was going to kill it. So we sort of were thinking, what do we want to do? What story do you want to tell? And we went to various clinics, getting permission first, and then going and kind of just like, let's go and see what it's like. And trying to figure out, is this the story you want to tell? Is that the story we want to tell? And then we kind of went back and looked at all the tape, basically, and said, this woman keeps, popping out. Like her story, she's as a character, she's very vibrant, and she's very contradictory, right? You start with Tracy, doing her daily prayer with her pastor as she's on speakerphone, right? Because she's working already. It's 6 o'clock in the morning. And I think often when you think about abortion clinics, if I were to say to 100 people on the street, this is a story about a very religious person and an abortion clinic, I think a lot of people would think I was talking about a protester. And so we thought it was just a very interesting thing that you didn't see a lot, a deeply religious person who is not just welcoming to the woman, she's the security guard. So she's responsible for the women who are coming in as clients or patients or however they're called. Various places have different names for them. So we just thought that was very interesting. She's a wonderful narrator. She really drives the story forward. And you can follow her in a day to really see what it's like. And she was very willing, of course, to be interviewed. And we were very clear about what it would take. And I think the risks, right? I mean, she starts the doc by pointing out all the risks of her job. And so we wanted to be very clear with everyone, like, this is what we're going to do. This is what we'd like to do. And here's, what we think can come out of it.
I would love for you to elaborate the kind of negotiations that took place to ensure the privacy and protection of everyone involved and to ensure the integrity and fullness of the story is there.
Yeah, I'm not even sure I would call it negotiations because it's very one-sided negotiations. We say, here's what we'd like, and then people can say, oh gosh, no, absolutely not. I was surprised how many women wanted in the clinic, the patients wanted to talk. I think there is this sense that there's a stereotype about who goes to an abortion clinic, that when you actually look at the video, you look at our documentary, you see couples coming in together. You see women in their 30s and 40s in there. And so I was very surprised that people really wanted to talk. Well, I thought I would have to really convince people. Anybody, obviously, who did not want their face shown, we would respect that. And anybody who didn't want to be in it at all, we respect that. But it wasn't a negotiation at all. I don't believe, and I never have really had to, arm wrestle people into like, hey, I need you to do this. We're very good at, and I think it's because we're very transparent. So I think people trust us when we say, here's what we're doing. We'd love you to be part of it. Here's why we think it makes sense. But if no, then no problem. And I always tell people, if you don't trust somebody, run. Run. It's the advice that I have for myself. If I don't feel good and that I can look into somebody's eyes and believe them, do not do a project with them. Run for the hills. And I think when you do that, you really end up having very good relationships because people trust you and you are very straightforward about what you're trying to do. You don't have to use trickery in any way. You've told everybody what you're doing. So everybody who's there is ready to do what you're doing. It makes everything so much easier.
You mentioned Tracy's faith and how she started the morning with her pastor in prayer. And that was one of the key observations I had while watching The Devil is Busy, is seeing how the framing of God and faith, seeing them as kind of like framing devices and telling the story, but also how they're used and understood differently depending on how you view abortion. So outside of the clinic, it's basically weaponized by these white male protesters who attempt to detract and degrade, even torment the people entering the clinic. Inside the clinic, God and faith are used as a form of protection. Tracy begins her day with prayer and ends her day with prayer. How did you and your team approach the nuances of that while producing this doc?
In a lot of ways, some of it was not nuanced at all. The protesters, you hear them all the time. And often when I've done a handful of pieces on abortion clinics or abortions as a political issue over the many years now that I've been in journalism, and often what you do is soundful protesters, drop the sound, tell your story. And I thought it was such an interesting strategy. You hear the protesters all the time in this doc, which is how you hear them. There would be times when we would be on the phone with Crystalline, and you'd be like, Crystalline, you got to go inside. We can't hear you. She's like, I am inside, because the protesters' noise never stops. And we wanted to give listeners, viewers, a chance to really experience that sense of like what it's like to have that grinding, constant, annoying, droning on. It just never, you don't get a break from it ever. And so I thought that was a really kind of factually accurate and overt way of kind of bringing the experience to the viewer. When you see the signs, someone asked me the other day, how did you pick which signs to shoot? I'm like, those are the signs. And not only the signs, the ones that say Black Lives Matter, et cetera, in front of the clinic, those are in front of lots of clinics. It's not particularly unusual for this particular clinic. And of course, the most interesting thing to me is when Tracy is pointing out, Doug, that's Doug, she says early on, because he's one of the protesters. They know each other, right? There's this line that they don't cross, but they know each other. And, it turns out that one of the protesters actually, who's it's basically telling him, that Black mothers shouldn't abort their children. And she's like, yeah, he served time because he set fire to a Black church. And it's almost a moment of comedy, right? Because you begin to realize this sense of like who these people are and this line that they're sort of on either sides of. But we really wanted to give a realistic look at what a day in the life of obviously Tracy, but also the clinicians, also the clients, the patients who are there, what it is to be there.
I was thinking about just how did you and your team think about the ways in which, how much time and space to give these protesters? A topic that constantly gets reignited in journalism is both sides, right? Giving equal weight to opposing views, which can have major downsides in the lack of accuracy and creating false equivalencies, among other things. This isn't a doc about showing both sides.
Correct.
However, there's this, you hear the protesters either directly or indirectly. So firstly, what is your view on the issue of both sides in journalism? And secondly, what was your approach around how much time and space to give these protesters without it impeding the intent of the film?
Yeah, I find both sidesing things so frustrating that sometimes I want to punch my television. And I think it's because it's not really done because the other side is there. I think it's because the journalist feels a little guilty, like, I just want to make sure I'm covered. And so that they're just not really sure of the story they're trying to tell. Fran Tarkenton, the quarterback, said to me once, Soledad, if you have 3 quarterbacks, you have no quarterbacks. And I remember thinking, like, I know nothing about sports metaphors. That means absolutely nothing to me, Fran. Thank you. But what he was trying to say was this idea of, like, if you don't commit to the story you're going to tell, then you have nothing. You have a big blob of trying to pop lots of different things in, and you end up with nothing at all. Mm-hmm. This story does not sit down and say, now we want to hear from the protester. This is Tracy's day in her life of what she does, who she interacts with, how it works. And so to me, that was in keeping with it. And you always have to figure out, like, where do the protesters come in? Is the experience you're showing in the piece the experience that the patients are having, that the clinicians are having, that Tracy and the security team is having? Like, is it real? If you had not put the protesters in at all, it would be so unrealistic to what it's like and what the women and their partners, because lots of men come in too, with their spouses, it would be so unrealistic to the situation, right? So I think it's a matter of, and then of course there's time, considerations, et cetera, and do you like the shot that you have, obviously. But I think it was just figuring out, if the story is Tracy's, where does this fit in? That we learn about the protesters in the same way Tracy learns about the protesters, right? Mm-hmm. We see the protesters often from her vantage point, right? Looking down upon them, because she's kind of up on a little bit of a hill up the driveway. So yeah, both sidesing it. I think some issues do have both sides, and I think adding context and clarity for people is very important. But very often, both sidesing it is this idea of, I don't want to get in trouble, and I don't want to have anybody, push back on my story. So this way I'm covered. One of the worst examples is, a scientist from NASA, and then next you go to, well, Billy Bob thinks the Earth is flat. Let's go to him next. And, you're like, and that's happened more than once. Or what was her name? Exercise lady from The Biggest Loser. Why is she talking about slavery? Why?
Right.
Why? No
need.
No, ma'am. Need. No. Yes, exactly. And so I don't understand. That's not quite a both sides issue, but that is this idea of a lack of expertise that allows people to just claim it and then, become a voice of something. Mm-hmm. So I think those things actually all go together. And yeah, I'm a big hater of both sidesing it.
You made that very bold and clear.
And on Twitter, too, over the years, I've made it very clear.
I want to go back to you mentioning building trust with your sources, with your subjects in the docs. How do you deal with giving them agency in the process while also asserting your own needs and boundaries as a journalist? Yeah,
I think for the most part, in every project, not just this project, but every project I've done, I think when you just tell people what you want to do and you're honest about it and you're explaining, like, I need you to do this because what we want to see is this and this and this, right? Mm-hmm. I need you to. I have never really had anybody, that's not true. Every so often you get someone whose dream is to be a director and they're like, the way I see this going is, and sometimes they've got really good points. So I listen to people if they have something they want to add and think that there's something they could, that I'm missing. But I don't think you have to worry about like them pushing back and being worried, et cetera, when on the front end, you've done all the work to say, here's what we're doing. So here's what we're going to do now. And here's what we're doing next. Okay, so now we finished that. Here's what we're going to do now. And it makes sense, right? Because they're seeing it. There's nothing worse than feeling like someone's misleading you, because for a lot of people being on television, for many people, it's their first time. And so it's scary and you just don't know. And I would tell people all the time, I don't give people the questions I'm going to ask, mostly because I often will sort of follow a thread if I think about it. So I don't want to mislead them. I say, I'm not going to, give you the questions just because I might not stick to them. And I would hate for you to think I'm being dishonest. So, but here's basically what we're going to cover. If you need to stop because you want to look up a statistic, you are welcome to stop and get that. And then I'll tell them, that like, this is what's coming down the pike. And so I have found the more prep you do, you really you're not arguing with people about, how they're feeling about something because you've just been very consistent. This is the story we're trying to tell. We want to focus on Tracy. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. We'd like to shoot it like this, et cetera, et cetera. And listen, if someone says to me, I'd like to see the shot, a lot of times you get that. Mm-hmm. How do I look in the, then I'm like, all right, let's take a grab of it. Let me bring it to you so you can see what it looks like we're taking this shot. Is that a good, how does that look? Because sometimes people just are concerned about how they're going to look. But I get that more, honestly, than somebody who's editorially trying to direct from their position. Because by the time we're shooting, we have covered all of that very, very clearly.
How do you know a story is best suited for a documentary treatment versus, say, a short doc versus long form or a podcast? Are the principles of storytelling the same in documentaries?
Sort of, mostly. Who Killed JFK had to be a podcast because what video are you going to show? I mean, some things, and it's why I love podcasts as a person who sometimes has felt very constrained about what are we covering this with. It's really nice to have really interesting conversations with people about an issue that matters that you don't have to cover visually. So, but I think it depends. I've had stories that I thought were a series and someone would say, actually, that's a great movie. I've had shorts that someone said, this thing is going really well, or, there's a twist. This is great. Let's make it a full length. Sometimes money dictates it. You have just enough money to do a short. or you are trying to do just a piece, of something 5 or 6 minutes, not something 40 minutes or not something 90 minutes. So, and a lot of it, then is the buyers. Buyers, shorts are unusual. Our short right now, The Devil is Busy, is on HBO. But shorts don't get a lot of love sometimes. People have to want to go out and see a short. So I understand how sometimes, shorts can get a little lost in the mix. So it really just depends. And I think at times, as you're putting stories together, we're able to tell Tracy's story in 31 minutes. It probably started at a little over 40 or 50, but then you start cutting it down, and then you say, okay, this works. This makes sense. And the money makes sense, and the distribution makes sense. It all works together. But there's no magic formula for it at all.
You're an executive producer of The Perfect Neighbor. It's a gut-wrenching documentary about how tensions escalate in a Florida neighborhood and results in the killing of Ajika Owens, a Black mother of 4 and a family friend of the film's director, Geeta Gambhir, one of your creative partners. The documentary gives viewers an intimate look into the lead-up of Susan Lorenz, a white woman who killed Ajika. The documentary is told entirely by police body cam footage, ring cameras, cell phones, interrogation room footage, and audio recordings. And it really brings viewers into the unfolding of the story rather than just the aftermath of it. How did the team land on the decision to tell the story this way?
So first, Geeta, of course, is a genius, and we do a lot of projects with Geeta and her team at Message Pictures. So it's, anytime she says anything, we're like, we're in, we'll do it. The editor for that piece is a really amazing editor named Viridiana Lieberman, and she's just remarkable as well. And I think the step one was, oh my God, this has happened. And we know that. Well, I remember seeing it on the wires, but then you realize when Geeta said, oh my God, we know her, she's the friend of the family. We know her. That was very surprising. And so step one was to just get down there and start shooting, like capturing what was happening. Because at that point it was, are they going to arrest her? What's going to happen? It was after the fact. I have covered a handful of stand your ground cases. And what you often find as a reporter is you land, right? And everybody is telling you the story in the past tense. Oh, here's what I thought of her. Oh, we knew that was going to happen. Oh, but to be able to see body cam and see really in real time what is unfolding is so remarkable. That body cam came about because of the legal team. It was a criminal case. The legal team got all of that just dumped on a drive. And then Geeta and Viridiana had to actually sift through it and help kind of figure out okay, Geeta tells hilarious stories about, at the beginning of the doc, there's probably 20 body cams. Who goes with what? How do you, so the work to pull it all together was absolutely heroic and amazing and impressive. And even when there's only a couple of police officers who show up, again, it was extremely amusing when they would talk about, if the police would just stand still for more than 3 seconds so they could get the shot. A frustrated editor who needs better shooting in the field. So I think it just, once that became a thing, it became very clear, and they were able to start piecing it together and clean up the audio. Then it became as Geeta has said, she saw it actually as sort of this thriller, just kind of unfolding in front of you because it was in real time, and nobody, as they're being interviewed by the police, has a glimpse of what's going to happen at the end, versus when you're a reporter, the end has already happened and everybody's now piecing it together after the fact. And that really does change the topic. And the other thing I thought was so interesting, it revealed a lot about a neighborhood that you think you know and you didn't know. I was surprised at how well a multiracial working class neighborhood got along. At one point, one of the moms, white mom, is like, "Oh, they're all my kids," genuinely kind of, and just how much the police got along with the community members, how everybody seemed to know that this woman was the problem, and yet there wasn't much that could be done. Sometimes I have disagreements with people who think, the police should have been able to do something. I don't know what, for example, Susan Lorenz called the police constantly, but no one in the neighborhood ever called the police on her. So I'm not sure what you could do. don't know that anybody really saw that, coming down the pike. There's no soundbite in there of like, one day this lady's gonna do blah, 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 blah. So, I think it just was a matter of once you get the material together, you start by running down there to figure out the story. And then once you get the material together, you use your best material. Geeta, also an editor, has been an editor for a long time. And I think that actually really shapes her view of how to put stories together.
Now, you mentioned the material and the information being on that hard drive and it being dumped on the team and how they had to sift through it. And how that was acquired, both the body cam footage and the audio, was through the Freedom of Information Act, which the requests were made by the legal team representing Adrika's family. For journalists and storytellers unfamiliar with obtaining a FOIA and working with the information from it, what are some things they should be mindful of?
That's a great question, and I'm not the FOIA person because I am smart enough. FOIA is a very specific thing. And actually, if you know anyone who does FOIAs and you're trying to figure out a FOIA, become friends with that person and have that person help you do your FOIA. It's very important that you're very specific. There's a real strategy to it. It's not here's some broad strokes advice on how to do FOIAs. We've done FOIAs for a lot of the projects that I've been in, and I always have a producer. I did a story on a young woman who's a great reporter, crime reporter, really more like she covers prison system more than crime, really, is probably the proper way to put it. And she was telling me that sometimes she'll do 100 FOIAs in a weekend. Like, it's a thing. And so I do not do FOIAs. I pay for lawyers who do FOIA. But it's actually so specific that if someone wants to do a FOIA, I would say there's lots of reporters who have great experience in FOIAs. Find them, have them help you, give you very specific advice about what you should do. And then you too, down the road, can become an expert in FOIAs.
That was great advice right there. So thank you, Soledad.
Sure. So
you wear many hats.
So many. But not the FOIA hat. But yes. Never. I'm smart enough not to wear. I'm smart enough not to do the things I'm not good at.
What dictates the role you decide to take for each project, whether you're going to be the reporter, narrative voice on projects like War en la Radio or the End of Affirmative Action, or when you're behind the scenes and shaping the creative direction and giving notes and feedback as an EP?
It really depends on if you've sold it and somebody says, we need this to be a correspondent-driven piece. Or some shows only do correspondence. For the show that I did, matter of fact, nope, we didn't do. Occasionally we do in their own words, but 99 times out of 100, we did a correspondent driving the story. So sometimes you're on this platform, you've got a correspondent. Conversely, lots of places are like, we do not use correspondence at all. And so, if you're going there with your project, you're not going to have a correspondent. Sometimes people just want wraps, right? We need an anchor. We need you to front the piece and toss to it, but we actually aren't going to have you in the piece. So a lot of times it just sort of depends on what the person wants. And often we have a big say in that. We'll sort of say, here's how we see it. This is what makes sense. So if someone's buying your project, they buy into your theory of how the story should be told. Sometimes we come in, I'm asked to be an executive producer. We've got a bunch of projects that people have asked me to pop in on, and it's really their project, and I just get to sometimes give funding, sometimes give advice, sometimes throw the party at the end, depending on what we need. Sometimes I'm in the field shooting and doing interviews. So it really kind of just depends for each project what's needed.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about the importance of creative partnerships. You've talked at length about Geeta Gambhir, whom you've worked with on docs such as Black and Missing, Hungry to Learn, The Devil is Busy, and The Perfect Neighbor.
And the Netflix doc about Katrina, Come Hell or High Water.
Yes. And also your executive producer, Rose Arce, who has been a longtime collaborator, formerly of CNN, and now the VP of your production company. Tell us about finding your creative partners and cultivating these partnerships. What advice do you have in building and maintaining them?
Yeah, it's really hard and it's really crucial. There's a sort of a truism in business of like, you're only as good as your team. And I think that's very true. And I think it's very hard to find a good team. And in terms of just good, in terms of like you like and respect their work and their work ethic, and also that you have the same values. One thing I've always really loved about Geeta and Message Pictures and all of our partners, frankly, is they're very into who is being hired to do the work. Crystalline talks a lot about, if we're going to be in an abortion clinic, we need to make sure that the team that we have, the photographers, the sound people, like everybody, how we divide that up. It's very important to us, who we're interfacing. A lot of thought goes into that. I remember we won an award for our project series that we did called Black and Missing. And great project. Gita, we worked with Gita on that as well. And I said in our acceptance speech, because we won this big award at the end, and I was like, my production company is literally this big. And I have 4 women of color directing each of those episodes. So you big giant companies, like, I know you can find it because I'm this big, right? Like, I don't have the budget to throw money at solving this problem. So it's doable. And I know if you really wanted to, you could solve that problem. But a lot of it is Gita especially, but everybody on the team, they just value that. They just really value the idea of we have great directors and great producers and great shooters, and they're very diverse, and they're all people we've worked with before. And so I have really enjoyed that, and I value that in a team. I'm always a little dismayed when I work with someone and it's sort of no, we have these people, this is the same people all the time. One thing Gita does brilliantly, and it's such a great model, is she grows people. So for example, I've worked with Crystal in Hampton a lot as a producer, and then she came in as a director for us on The Devil is Busy. So this is her first directorial, project. Amazing. But Gita's very good at taking people and saying, now I think they should be here, and now they should be here. And that is a really, I think there's a lot of good mentors, but I think a mentor who can really move people in positions and then help them succeed. Make sure that, I know they're good enough to do this. I'm going to be here just to keep an eye on everything, and we're all going to make sure we're going the right direction. I have found that really remarkable, frankly, and incredibly unusual, and I very much value it. So we love that.
Now, you mentioned the Katrina doc on Netflix, but I want to go back and take a look back at your time at CNN for a moment, particularly your Hurricane Katrina coverage. How did that coverage from 20 years ago shape both the reporter you have become and the documentary work you're doing now?
It was a lot, actually. I think covering Katrina was probably the first time that I felt like this is the job I'm supposed to be doing. That was a year, 2005, when we were in the field all the time. So many stories broke. You'll remember at Christmas, you had the Southeast Asian tsunami. So I went to Thailand and just we had back to back to back to back. I think the Pope died that year. There were so many stories that broke that year. So we were in the field nonstop. And I think with Katrina, it felt like we were doing such a service, right? We were actually helping people find people. We were explaining things. We were holding elected officials accountable. Democrats, Republicans did not matter, and they were all in that mix. It just felt we were on the ground so we could tell people this is what's happening right now, right here. CNN sent 50 teams of people to go cover that story. I mean, the amount of money that was put into it, and there was no... you couldn't make money because, of course, we ran no commercials during our coverage.
Right.
And then you just go to shelters and anybody who was trying to find somebody. We had a whole board so that you could find people who were, missing and see if you could track down loved ones. So it just felt like, wow, this is what journalism should be, right? Providing very good information, helping people understand the story, answering questions. Well, why didn't they just leave? They knew a hurricane was coming. Why don't they just go drive somewhere and go to a hotel? All these questions because people didn't necessarily understand the culture of the community, that you might live on the same road as your mom and your aunt. So there's not necessarily anywhere to go. It was really, I just thought it was for me, it really opened my eyes to the kind of reporting I wanted to do. And I just felt like, yeah, this is exactly it. And in some ways, it made my career. I got a lot of airtime, so I could make mistakes and get better and practice. And we did a lot of live anchoring, meaning you just stand there hour after hour and do interview. I remember bumping into the mayor And I was just walking. We were just shooting. I popped a mic on him, and we did a really great walking interview through the walkway around the Superdome. You know, just off the top, like no prep, no nothing. But you didn't need it because your prep was that you had been there for a long time. So I thought it was a very high point in the work that I did. And I'm very proud of that work. And it made me feel very proud to be a journalist. I often tell people this story, and sometimes I get choked up in telling it, but it's been 20 years. Maybe I won't. We were shooting, I would go in for a month, and then my co-anchor, Miles O'Brien, would go in for a month, and then I would swap back and forth. My kids were pretty little then, too. And I remember going back out, and I was in, you'd get these clothes at like Old Navy, and everything was so dirty. There was no place to take a shower, that when you got home, you just took everything and just ditched it because it was absolutely gross. And of course, I had the luxury, the advantage of the dirtier my hair is, the better it looks. So we were just disgusting, is my point. As we're walking through the Baton Rouge airport, I'm trying to get to my plane, and I had my CNN hat on my very dirty hair, and people gave us a standing ovation. Think about that now. That would not happen now. No one's given any journalist a standing ovation. But I remember thinking, like, this is because they understand. Like, this is what we're supposed to be doing, regardless of what people believe and what political side they're on. Like, we're here to provide information and give people an understanding about something terrible that's unfolding. It just felt like it was exactly kind of hitting the stride of what I wanted to do.
Now, since your CNN days, a lot has changed in how we meet viewers where they are. So I'm curious, from your POV, how has YouTube and more broadly social media changed the documentary space?
You know, I don't think it's only changed the documentary space. I think it's changed everything in media. And maybe even it's changed the TV news space even more because, you know, I think news organizations are competing for eyeballs. It used to be, when I worked at the Today Show, like, oh, you just wanted to beat GMA. Like, you got to get that. You got to book this person before GMA gets them. Now, you know, it's really challenging because you have so many eyeballs. Like my darling children do not watch TV. They don't watch TV news, but they don't even watch TV. They'll watch things on their laptop. I mean, if I have it on in the living room and it's a movie, maybe they'd come and sit next to me, but so it's a whole different world in terms of how we get information and how easy it is to access it and how you can go down this algorithm of just everything that you like fed to you constantly. So I think that's the difference, is that there's competition for eyeballs, which has really changed to some degree journalism, right? You have a lot more opinion and people, I would say, just trying to be sassy and provocative and interesting. I mean, when the New York Times the other day, what was the name of that article? I guess it was a column, Have Women Ruined the Workplace? Clearly, those are people who are desperately trying to, you know, get clicks in some capacity, right? You'd be provocative and whatever. And I think for a lot of us, we're like, this is stupid, so I'm not going to read it. Or I'm going to read someone's take on it later. But I'm certainly not going to click on this through the NewYorkTimes.com because I don't want to give any vote toward this being popular. You know, so there's a lot of, and I think there's a lot of that in cable news too, right? We did some of it, I did some of it, which was, you know, both sides and everybody, this person's yelling at this person. And there's not really an understanding. You know, again, you're not trying to get to like, so can you explain what this debate is about? Why do these people believe this? And why do those people believe that? Like, sometimes I think that's more important than the actual argument, but you don't really get that kind of context. It's why I really loved doing Matter of Fact for such a long time, because my boss, my producer, Rita Alaman used to talk a lot about the show being a teaching hospital of news. Like, we're here to help people understand the story. We really don't care what side they take, but we want them to understand what's at issue. And I thought that was a really helpful way of looking at the news. And I really liked that strategy a lot. I don't need my TV anchors to be bros chit-chatting with each other. That's me personally. I don't watch it. I don't like to watch people yell at each other and then the anchor says, well, gentlemen, we're out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. You know, I just don't like it. So, and it doesn't educate me. I often want someone to explain, well, then tell me what is happening. And it's hard to find that. So I think social media and all that has really changed, you know, kind of the tenor of news.
So where does Soledad O'Brien go for her news?
I have the dilemma of doing both all and nothing. Sometimes I find the news so distressing that, especially if I'm doing a lot in docs, I don't read it like I used to. There was a time that if, you could call me at midnight and say, did you just see such and such cross? And I'd be like, yes, oh my gosh, I know all about it. Now I'd be like, I'm not read in. I haven't, maybe tomorrow afternoon I'll probably get around to catching up on those stories, which was kind of unheard of for me years ago. So I'm definitely not as knee deep in it as I was in terms of being very, very, very up to date all the time. Which is good, because in documentaries, you really need to be knee deep in the project you're working on more than anything. But I love reading things. I find stuff coming at me because it's like a fire hose to be a lot. And so I like sitting down and reading articles and reading. And I think you get a lot more context when you read. People say, it's what I like about podcasts too, right? So let's step back 15 years. And all of a sudden we're stepping back 15 years. You can't really do that in TV news. You could do that in podcasts. You could certainly do it in an article that helps you understand, like, oh, I understand why they're fighting now because, 15 years ago, such and such happened. So I think reading things, and that means everything. I mean, not like crazy stuff, but I do like social media a lot. And so I can often figure out, what the conversation is. And then Wall Street Journal, New York Times, even though I frequently hate the New York Times. I try to keep msnow.com, CNN.com. I prefer sort of the online versions of things because I can read more of the articles as opposed to having that just kind of come at me.
So I want to talk a little bit about your voice. You have a recognizable voice, and if you're doing
it's fake.
Well,
it is. I grew up in Long Island, and NBC sent me to Juilliard to work on my.
This is the story I want you to tell because I
yes.
want to say I heard just a snippet of this story when you were in conversation with Isaac Mizrahi on their podcast. So yes, please, you're a Long Island girly. So
oh my God, call me later. So and my parents are both foreigners. My mom was my parents passed away in 2019, but my dad was from Australia. My mom was from Cuba. So they didn't have strong Long Island accents themselves. So I didn't have the worst Long Island accent, but I definitely, water was always a word that was hard. I can't say dinosaur to this day because I always have to make people write a large prehistoric beast. So then they sent me to Juilliard to work on my voice and my accent and really just learning my enunciation was always pretty good, but cleaning it up a little bit. And it was so much fun. I really loved, the tricks, they have you do your warm up, those kind of things. It was really helpful. And I ended up with this very generic-y, could be from anywhere sort of accent. If I go back to Long Island for more than 4 days, I got it back again, but I start slipping back into it. But yeah, it was actually incredibly helpful. And I really felt that it allowed you to kind of go anywhere. I had some friends who would say, oh my God, you should be so offended. And I'm like, no, I think it's good to be able to kind of work anywhere if you want to, and not have your accent get in the way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That said, a Long Island accent is different than a very cute Southern drawl, which is different than a very fabulous New Orleans. Come on. So maybe I wouldn't have changed it if I thought I had a really adorably cute accent. I have a couple of friends from New Orleans and a bunch of friends from Texas. They have the best accents, mm-hmm. and they lay it on thick.
How long did it take for this voice transformation to happen?
It wasn't really a transformation as much as kind of getting rid of stuff, mm-hmm. I would say. So I don't think anybody noticed. Like my parents weren't shocked one day when they heard me. But, I worked with a really great voice coach for a couple of months.
Lastly, a couple weeks ago, I reached out to Sabrina Ford, who is a journalist, researcher, fact checker, also a coffee entrepreneur.
Yeah.
I told her I was interviewing you, and she reminded me that one year while we were at the National Association of Black Journalists convention, we heard you speak, and you told a story about the importance of being a witness. And the story involves your beloved mother. And I know you've told this story a few times before, but I feel like it's worth retelling.
It's such a good story. And it's so funny because I think like everybody, you really love your mom, and then sometimes you're wildly embarrassed by your mom, and then you're frustrated by your mom. I had just started college, so I was home from college, and my mom had a gold Chevette, reference back to my Long Island conversation. My mom had a gold Chevette, and in order to borrow her car while I was home, I had to drop her at school. She was a teacher in my high school, and then I could go, and I had to come back and pick her up at the end of the day. So I dropped her at school, and then at 3 o'clock or whenever she was done, I would swing by and pick her up. And I went in and grabbed her and came out. And our school was very, and still is to this day, non-diverse. I think Smithtown is something like 90% white. And probably when I was a student, it was 93% white. Like, it's white. So we were walking out. My mom was probably 5'2", short afro. She used to have this horribly embarrassing hat that looked like a skunk, but it was purple. That she had her skunk hat that she would wear. Anyway, so my mom's walking out, and she's got her little hat on, and she had this PBS tote bag, because we subscribed, we had PBS, so we sent the money, get the tote bag. And as we're walking out, the principal and the vice principal had stopped a young black kid who's probably like 9th grade, maybe 14. And there are probably 2 black kids in the school. And I remember my mom stopping and kind of just standing there and sort of planting herself. And the principal and the vice principal said, Mrs. O'Brien, we got it, you can move on. And she just stood there. This is where my mother was very challenging, right? Just kind of like, no, I'm good. And she just stood there and would not move on. And I'm like, oh my God, come on, let's go. Like, if I drop her at home, I get the car for the rest of the day. And she just stood there. And it was so interesting to watch, because in that moment of time, and she was so it's a principal, the vice principal, the kid, me and my mom, like all in this relatively small space. And I remember the kid looking at my mom, and I remember thinking like, oh, there is this power transfer. That was a real transfer of, like, my mom suddenly was the most powerful person in the room. 5'2", little PBS tote bag. And she's just like, no, I'm good. I'm good. And I've actually seen this since then. I'm sure every black reporter has, right? There's always that lady in the neighborhood who's like, no, I got you. Mm-hmm. That it's the same vibe that the lady who's serving food in the cafeteria when you're at college, PWI, right? And it's like, no, I got you. Let me get you. Or the person who's a security guard who says, hey, listen, don't forget,
yes.
The person in the elevator.
Yes.
Who says, baby, don't forget you got to do, whatever. Like, so. And I just remember thinking, like, my mother was in charge here. Everybody got very embarrassed and awkward, and the kid kind of sat there. And then finally the principal said, don't run in the halls, and the kid went off. But it was so interesting, right? Because I think she was basically telegraphing, like, I'm not going to do anything, but I'm here to be a witness of whatever's going to happen with this kid, who was clearly in an unfamiliar. I didn't go to school there, and he was in an unfamiliar environment, and felt very concerned. Mm-hmm. And I just remember thinking, I was so proud of her, because it was just like, it was so cool to sort of think, there's this tremendous value in just being like, I'm actually just going to stand here and take notes,
Mm-hmm.
And so that later, everyone knows that I am here watching what is happening here. And I have seen that in so many of the stories that I've done over the years, and it's great. And I was very proud of my mom at that moment. It was awesome.
Thank you for sharing that story, because it also, I can see how it shapes the work that you do. Yeah,
I think there's something about being unmovable. Everybody should think about it, just like, no, I'm not just going to move along when I think I see something unfolding. I'm just not. Not just for me and my work, but I think everybody kind of has that opportunity today, especially in an environment where there's just a lot of stuff unfolding every day. And I think people need to be very aware and very cognizant of, like, what's unfolding around them.
Absolutely. Soledad O'Brien, thank you so much for joining me here on the Nieman Storyboard podcast. I appreciate you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Soledad and Christina, and thanks to all of you for listening. If you like what we're doing with Nieman Storyboard, leave us a written review and a rating in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also share this podcast with a friend. We'll see you soon.